Gentle viewers and gentlemen viewers, good morning or evening, wherever you are, and welcome. Welcome to this episode of Shakespeare Views on the News, a program that arbitrarily selects and attempts to interpret events of our times from a so-called Shakespearean point of view. The title of the show is We Create Our Own Reality, and it is actually a quote uttered by a bigwig in the US government of the time, namely Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense from 2001 to 2006, and one of the architects of the war against Iraq. Now, looking at the world in the same spirit that we find described in the famous tale by French classic Voltaire, the following Shakespearean quote from the play King Henry IV, Part 2, would perhaps be a good fit. Thus we play the fools with the time, and the spirits of the wise sits in the cloud and mock us. Incidentally, uttering these words is the Prince of Wales, who will become later King Henry V, and to whom, King Henry V, Shakespeare dedicates a separate play. When attempting to assemble an episode of Shakespeare's Views on the News, I often find myself in a position that perhaps we may find ourselves in when deciding on which items to choose among several that deserve equal attention, and particularly so in this episode. Yet, the examples here following disclosed reflect in an almost dramatic way a statement by Edward Bernays, interestingly a nephew of Sigmund Freud. A statement about the manipulation of the collective mind, which Bernays takes for granted, perhaps even with a hint of satisfaction. And it goes as follows. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinion of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who wish to manipulate the unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. As a current application of the principle, and as we know, the United States and Israel declared war on Iran at the end of February of 2026, it is interesting, though perhaps depressing, to look at the so-called official version given of the events, and to realize once more that for those who ride the tide of pomp that beats upon the high shores of the world, a quote from Henry V, by the way, for these people the world at large is assumed essentially stupid. Therefore, the world can be easily persuaded, to quote Oscar Wilde, to believe anything, provided it is quite incredible. 4. It is perhaps painful to admit it, however obvious, the so-called people are an abstraction, and with minimum effort has historically proven, this abstraction can be used to justify any act, however preposterous or criminal, and to convince the audience that it is they, the people, who act and determine the course of action, and not the real characters behind the scene, those who ride the tide of pomp, as I quoted before. And here is a historical literary example. In the play Richard III, for various political reasons, Richard has decided that a nobleman in name and character called Hastings will prove his enemy, the enemy of Richard. And this would happen when Richard will assassinate the two children, one of whom is the heir to the throne, and his brother, both kept prisoners in the Tower of London. Of course, Richard wants to become king. In the scene I am referring to, Richard pretends to become suddenly paralyzed via the witchcraft of two ladies connected with the legitimate king. Lord Hastings, whom Richard suspects of favoring the legitimate heir to the throne, this Lord Hastings says that he will investigate the claim about the witchcraft, if true. Richard, who was ready for this retort by Hastings, proclaims the instant condemnation to death of Lord Hastings with these words: "If I, thou protector of this damned strumpet, tellest thou me of this, of ifs, thou art a traitor. Off with his head. Now by St. Paul I swear I will not dine until I see the same. Lovell and Ratcliffe, look at it be done. The rest that love me, rise and follow me." There is no way out. There is no way out for Lord Hastings, who had disregarded the warnings of a friend and was acting in good faith. No way for Hastings to save himself. He exits the scene with a declaratory statement, the first line of which is, "Woe, woe for England, not a whit for me," and so on. Applying or extending the concept to our own times, the reason for launching the recent war against Iran in the hope of subjugating the country and appropriating its resources, which, by the way, was almost a replica of the recent Venezuela enterprise, this epic effort is as plausible as the reason of Richard III to kill the noble Hastings, or perhaps, as plausible as the reasons why the wolf killed the lamb in one of Aesop's fable. The lamb did not have any weapons of mass destruction, but according to the wolf, the lamb was muddying the water that the wolf was drinking. "But how can it be," says the lamb, "you are uphill relative to my position, and the water flows downhill." Says the wolf, "I do not want to listen to your reasons," and promptly kills the lamb. In the current instance, according to the official information by the powers that be, the reasons for the attack on Iran were: 1. Preempting an attack. U.S. officials claimed that intelligence indicators suggested that Iran was preparing conventional strikes requiring preemptive action to reduce potential casualties. In the version by Aesop, the wolf needed to kill the lamb to prevent the lamb from muddying the waters. The second justification was halting the nuclear development. This line has been repeated for at least 30 years, as clear from this picture. The age of which picture and the character I could not verify, but the mug of the protagonist compared to that of today should justify the 30-year approximation. The second reason was destroying military assets. The US and Israel aimed at annihilating Iran's conventional arsenal, particularly its growing supply of killer drones and ballistic missiles. It would be futile even to question these official statements and their logic. But to keep the flame of history alive, so to speak, there are reasons to bring to mind for those who have some respect for factual history. I mean, bring to mind two facts, both connected with the earlier war to destroy, in that case, to destroy Iraq. One is an official statement of the time. "We are an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality." Now, as often in this case, disputes arise as to who actually said these words, whether in the instance it was Secretary Rumsfeld, or a senior White House aide to Rumsfeld. Whoever the uttered may have been, both were swimming in the same broth, to use a metaphor. In any case, their actual acting in the various wars that they engage themselves in proves the truth of the pronouncement. That is, we create our own reality, like then, like now, we could almost say as regards Iran. The other relevant statement is perhaps the even more famous, or I should say notorious. In the now distant February 2003, Colin Powell, U.S. Commander-in-Chief, addressed as some of you may remember, the United Nations Security Council to present intelligence showing that Iraq and Saddam Hussein were concealing weapons of mass destruction. During the speech, he dramatically held up a tiny glass vial filled with white powder as evidence of the imminent risk of a biological anthrax attack by Iraq. Now, I remember this episode particularly well for one of those somewhat mysterious reasons whereby our mind remembers with curious accuracy the moment, the place, the surroundings, and the times when an episode occurred. In the instance, it was during a meeting of the, believe it or not, the Portland French-speaking club, when one of the members, actually a teacher in a public secondary school, while discussing the war in Iraq, affirmed with a tone of conviction and certainty, "Now, it is sure that Saddam has weapons of mass destruction." The episode proves, if it were still necessary, it proves how easy it is to colossally fake the truth and be believed by millions. As we know, Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction. But this perception happens for a number of reasons. The elucidation and the enumeration of which reasons would vastly exceed the time that I allotted to this episode, as well as probably exceed the limits of the viewer's patience. Though it is significant that even a person, in this instance a qualified secondary school teacher, can be easily led to believe the unbelievable when the unbelievable is served on the plate of authority, to stretch the metaphor, and often delivered by characters whose integrity is questionable, to say the least. I would be tempted to add to the examples of mass deceit or mass hysteria the cruel, actually sadistic episode of the COVID epidemic, but I will not, simply because in these matters the believers in the official lines are frequently and sometimes personally offended by opinions contrary to their own. In this context, I'll quote a little but relevant recent episode. In a message exchanged with a contact overseas, I've completely forgot that the said contact is a Trump's admirer, an admirer of Trump, and I dare to make reference to Trump's frequent online messages, some of which are, let's say, disputable. Following this message, I received a short and cold reply, clearly taking issue with my characterization of Trump's online declarations. I almost felt as I had to deliver a personal offense, however involuntary. Yet the episode brought to my mind the line that the peaceful King Henry VI delivers when he finds that his guards have switched side and are now against him. "Look as I blow this feather from my face, and as the air blows it to me again, obeying with my wind when I do blow, and yielding to another when it blows. Commanded always by the greatest gust, such is the lightness of you common men." We could say, yes, indeed, commanded always by the greater gust, such is the lightness of you common men. However, on second thoughts, the quotation, though accurate, does not entirely apply to the contact whom I am afraid to have inadvertently offended. Perhaps more suitable are the lines with which Macbeth proclaims his loyalty to King Duncan. "The service and the loyalty I owe in doing it pays itself." Although, even here, the parallel is only approximately correct, because Macbeth would shortly later assassinate the King Duncan, whereas my friend and so many others look at Trump as he who could do no wrong, so to speak. Changing subject, Among the many recent episodes that, in my opinion, deserve a Shakespearean reference, the next has to do with the recently retired or dismissed, the recently retired Attorney General Miss Pam Bondi. And in the referred to episode that I mentioned here, Bondi was responding to questions posed by congressmen and senators during one of the sessions that are part, as we know, of the machinery of government. And here, in this case, it was regarding the Epstein saga. As it is known at large, the Epstein affair, or phenomenon, if you like, does not seem to have been eclipsed, as it was the hope of, or the plan, by some of the bigwigs involved in government and elsewhere. There are probably few people who are not aware of this cosmic affair, for lack of a better adjective. I say it was the hope of oblivion, as reflected, for example, in one of Trump's statements relative to the matter, as per this short and self-explaining extract in which Trump intervenes, suggesting that the whole Epstein business is now history and implicitly a waste of time to further discuss it.
Sure.
Could I just interrupt for
Sure.
a second? Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years. You're asking, we have Texas, we have this, we have all of the things. And are people still talking about this guy, this creep? That is unbelievable. Do you want to waste the time and do you feel like answering?
I don't mind answering.
I mean, I can't believe you're asking a question on Epstein at a time like this where we're having some of the greatest success and also tragedy with what happened in Texas. It just seems like a desecration, but you go ahead.
Sure.
But returning to Miss Bondi, during the joint section I referred to, she was being asked questions related to the Epstein affair and affair and business. In the instance, unable to answer coherently some of the questions about the Epstein enterprise, Bondi used the well-tested example of changing the subject and point out how good is the Dow Jones Index in this particular instance.
The Dow is over $50,000. I don't know why you're laughing. You're a great stock trader, as I hear, Raskin. The Dow is over 50,000 right now. The S&P at almost 7,000. And the NASDAQ smashing records. Americans' 401ks and retirement savings are booming. That's what we should be talking about. We should be talking about making Americans safe. We should be talking about, what does a Dow have to do with anything? That's what they just asked. Are you kidding?
It must be positively difficult for an official in such a high position to pretend that the Epstein business is now only history, especially when, as in the case of this joint session of Senate and Chamber, a good number of victims of the Epstein's trade were actually present and positioned just behind Bondi's table. And it is equally meaningful that not once during the fairly long session, not once Bondi turned to look at the victims. And it is equally difficult not to conclude that her posture conveyed the unmistakable message that, according to the Attorney General, the victims were irrelevant, or who knows, even worse than just irrelevant. Some may say that it is an arbitrary mine is an arbitrary and unwarranted observation, which may be true, of course. Yet, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, the posture or non-posture toward the Epstein victims by the Attorney General of the USA is a case in point. Because from Bondi's body language, one could conclude that the victims were non-persons, again, a la the non-person in the style of George Orwell. And remaining on the Epstein case, that, by the way, doesn't seem to fade away, for the reason that everybody knows, Apart from the Attorney General, who recently, by the way, resigned for unknown causes, there is another associated character who jumped on the stage, namely the FBI Director Kash Patel. Interesting first name, by the way, an abbreviation where Kash is not written with a C but with a K. This gentleman had the unpleasant task of demonstrating that the Epstein case did not occur, or possibly that it was greatly exaggerated, to borrow from one of Mark Twain's famous lines. Again, I refer to a joint recent session of both chambers, in which answering questions by senators and congresspersons was this esteemed head of the FBI, who apparently had the somewhat arduous task to demonstrate that all that pertains to the Epstein phenomenon, the millions of documents, thousands of videos, pictures, unquestionable and unimaginable debauchery, that all of this does or do not exist. But how can this be possible? How can the director of the FBI, the highest instrument in the nation for the preservation of law and order, how can he pretend that the Epstein infernal cabal, so really infernal, is questionable, and therefore maybe it didn't exist? Very simple, actually, and even ingenious, as you may verify by the following short video extract, in which the eximious highest preserver of law and order in the land resolves the problem by the introduction of a clever adjective, namely the term alleged. Epstein's and associates' their crimes are alleged, not proven, or if we like, shaken, not stirred. And Senator Kennedy poses a question about the Epstein affair. Whereupon the FBI director begins to answer by buying time with irrelevance and deflects the question by referring to a case involving another attorney general in a totally irrelevant episode of about 20 years ago. At this point, Senator Kennedy politely stops Patel, asking him to answer the original question. And it is in answering the question, as you can verify by the short video following, you can see that Patel has the courage, or perhaps it would be better to say, has the guts or the effrontery to implicitly nevertheless state that the Epstein monstrosities are only alleged, that is, not proven. As I said, stirred, not shaken. And here is the clip.
The only thing we are able to speak to publicly, because he was given a non-prosecution agreement by Mr. Acosta, is that first time period from, I believe, don't quote me on this, 97 to 2001-ish. And then when the Trump administration courageously reopened it.
Ask you, who, if anyone, did Epstein traffic these young women to besides himself?
Himself. There is no credible information. None. If there were, I would bring the case yesterday that he trafficked to other individuals. And the information we have, again, is limited.
So the answer is no one?
Because until recently, I did not realize that Trump is also the author of several books. Clearly, a deplorable oversight on my part, I must confess. The most recent book I found, at least following the sequence displayed online, is titled Think Big and Kick Ass in Business and Life, as you can see and verify from the front cover. What could we say? What could I say? The answer is nothing. Literally, I am bereft of words. Well, as usual, time has elapsed more quickly than I imagined, or as Shakespeare says in one of his sonnets, nothing against time's scythe can make defense. We are then at the end of this episode, and if you wish to convert Shakespeare into your own and personal weapon of mass persuasion, consider owning and using the unique and comprehensive dictionary, Your Daily Shakespeare, an arsenal of verbal weapons to drive your friends into action and your enemies into despair. which dictionary contains, among many other things, over 10,000 daily life situations linked to the most befitting Shakespearean quotation. And consider as well the combination book-internet file titled Shakespeare in Pictures, on both of which, the dictionary and the visual Shakespeare, this video series is based. Please contact me at the mail address immediately listed after the conclusion of this episode. And by the way, the graphic pictorial section of Shakespeare in Pictures is accessible online free of charge for you to get an idea. Thank you for watching, and as always, may all the number of the stars give light to your fair way.